Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North, and this the 10th and final episode in the Jeremy Bamber White House Farm arc. Let me start by admitting that this series took me longer to research than I anticipated, mainly because the more I read, the more complex it seems to be. On the surface, it appears a straightforward case. Jeremy Bamber, driven by a desire to claim a substantial inheritance, murdered his family, and then tried to frame his mentally ill sister. But there are so many other factors at play. The motives of the relatives and his girlfriend, the actions of the police, and the seemingly questionable evidence. And while the other episodes were fairly straightforward to write, this one has proven to be a challenge, to the point that I have written several iterations. Perhaps that's because after 40 years there are so many questions, theories and criticisms which have evolved and multiplied, leaving behind a tangled web through which to wade. But as time passes, evidence degrades, as do memories. People connected to the case have passed away, and documents remain sealed. There is possibly only one person still alive who knows all the answers. Jeremy Bamber, however, maintains that he is innocent, a stance which has garnered support over the years. While I initially planned to focus on the police investigation and the appeals, many of these have been intrinsically linked with the ongoing dispute regarding who was the killer at White House Farm. Therefore, I've opted to take a deep dive into the evidence, the criticisms, and the theories that revolve around the case. Join me as I close out this Jeremy Bamber arc, and as always, I would love to hear your thoughts on Facebook, Instagram, X, or YouTube. It is probably best to begin at what could be seen as the first of a catalogue of errors made by Essex Police, namely the initial phone call from Jeremy Bamber to Chelmsford Police Station on August the 7th, 1985. This is now known as the call during which Bamber informed the handler PC Michael West that his father had contacted him and stated his sister had hold of a gun and had gone mad. Jeremy's words during this call rendered it impossible for anyone else other than himself or Sheila to have been responsible. However, it was how this interaction between Jeremy and PC West was recorded which has opened it up for scrutiny. At trial, it was revealed that this call log had initially stated the conversation took place at 3:36 a.m, but PC West admitted that this was an error and the actual time was 3:26 a.m. This seems like a small but genuine mistake, and the fact that Malcolm Bonnet confirmed that he had dispatched cars to the scene at 3:35 a.m. seemed to support that the earlier time was correct. While this explanation seemed satisfactory at the time, a police log unearthed by Jeremy's team suggests that there were two separate callers that night, with the first call being received at 3:26 a.m, and beside the subject heading on the log is written, "Daughter gone berserk." It then names the caller as Mr. Bamber at White House Farm, Tolstant, Darcy, and details the complaint that his daughter, Sheila, quote, has got hold of one of my guns. Does this mean that Neville called the police that morning? Jeremy claimed he received a call from his father at roughly 3:10. During the call, he alleged his father told him about the issue at the farm, but the conversation ended abruptly and Jeremy's attempts to return the call were met with an engaged tone, as though the handset had not been put back on the cradle. But what if the reason for this was that Neville decided he needed police intervention, and the call recorded in the police log at 3:26 a.m. was made by him, an action which in turn prevented Jeremy from getting through to the farm. Unable to regain contact with his father, the 24-year-old called his girlfriend Julie at roughly 3:30 a.m, which is the time they both provided in their initial statements given on the day of the killings. The call between Jeremy and Julie was brief, and after they hung up, Jeremy decided to contact the police. However, he doesn't call 999. Instead, he looks up the direct line for the station, initially trying Witham Police Station without getting an answer, before calling Chelmsford. The search for the telephone numbers likely took a couple of minutes, meaning his call to the police took place at 3:36 a.m, which is consistent with the time PC West had initially recorded. As stated in previous episodes, the timing of the calls made to and by Jeremy cannot be verified, as itemised billing didn't exist at the time, which has only added to the multiple debates surrounding this case. The prosecution used the lack of verifiable timing to suggest that Jeremy had lied about receiving a call from his father, an accusation supported by the evidence of telephone engineer Robert Cox, who informed police that if the phone at the farm had not been returned to its cradle following the call between Jeremy and Neville, it would have left the line open, preventing the 24-year-old from making any further calls. This situation could only be resolved if the handset at Whitehouse Farm was placed back on the cradle, severing the link, or if Jeremy's phone remained on its cradle undisturbed for 10 minutes. However, Jeremy had claimed that he had attempted to call his father back several times immediately after the line went dead, meaning that the 10-minute cycle was interrupted, thus keeping the line open. When officers entered the home, they found the phone off the hook, implying that the call to Jeremy had ended by a finger being pressed on the cradle. The prosecution argued that Jeremy would have been unable to place a call to Julie or to the police given the handset's position, with them proposing that Jeremy had not received a call from his father that night. Instead, he had removed the handset while staging the scene. But what if Neville had placed a call to the police that night? Could that have severed the link between Whitehouse Farm and Jeremy's cottage, meaning that Jeremy would have been able to make outgoing calls? This does leave one question: why was the handset off the cradle? One possible explanation may come from the strange markings found on Neville Bamber's body. The trio of circular burn marks were believed to have been caused by the barrel of the gun being pressed against his back, and perhaps this was done during the phone call, with Neville or his assailant placing their finger on the cradle to end the conversation, and the 61-year-old placed the handset on the countertop as he tried to appear compliant. There is another proposed scenario for how these burn marks occurred, which has been put forth by Jeremy's team. I have linked a video covering this in the description box below. In order for the scenario of Neville having the gun placed to his back being viable, we have to consider the proposed order of events. Bullet casings found in the bedroom suggest that Neville was initially shot 4 times in that location prior to confronting his killer in the kitchen. To support the claim that the call between father and son didn't occur, the prosecution pointed out the absence of blood on or around the phone, with them adding that upon entering the kitchen, Neville was already injured. But the unearthed call logs cast doubt on this scenario, leading to the question: had there actually been 2 calls reporting the same incident made by 2 separate individuals, and could they have been inadvertently amalgamated by the police? If Neville had called the police at 3:26 a.m, it would explain why cars were dispatched prior to the secondary call supposedly made by Jeremy Bamber at 3:36 a.m. But there are several unanswered questions, including: was Neville already injured when the calls were made? And why did neither Jeremy nor the police report hearing any disturbance in the background of the calls? Or was there no call, just an input error by the call handler, and a potential misinterpretation of the log created by Malcolm Bonnet? Upon receiving the call, PC West passed the information to the dispatcher Malcolm, who created his own record and sent the cars to the scene. Is it possible that the document written by Malcolm has been misconstrued? When one looks at Malcolm's log, it lists the caller as Neville Bamber, the address of the incident, Whitehouse Farm, and the complaint being made that his daughter had hold of a gun. So either Malcolm spoke to Neville, or he was writing it from the perspective of Jeremy, the person who had called to report the incident. It does, however, seem a strange way to record the details, and its discovery alongside PC West's error in noting the time has allowed for dual interpretations of the evidence, with some seeing it as proof that the father and son called the police that night, while others believe it simply demonstrates one of many errors made by Essex Police. It is little discrepancies like the call logs which have paved the way for speculation regarding what truly happened that night, and in turn has prompted questions as to whether Jeremy should have been convicted. Another aspect of the case, which has gained traction over time, is the suggestion that while Jeremy was waiting outside the farmhouse with the police, various occurrences pointed to the notion that someone was still alive in the house. As the first officers on the scene walked the perimeter of the home, they noted light seeping through the curtains in the main bedroom, and it was against these curtains that a shadow seemed to move. Could this have indicated that someone was still moving around inside, or was it simply a trick of the light as stated by Sergeant Chris Buse at trial? However, Douglas Adams, a member of the firearms team, advised Heidi Blake of the New Yorker in 2024 that this sighting had been treated as a serious possibility at the time. This shadow on its own may not have been enough to fuel suggestions that as Jeremy stood outside, there was someone moving within the home, but additional incidents have fanned these flames. First, there was an alleged 999 call made from within the farmhouse at 6:09 a.m. Having been informed of the incident at the farm at around about 3:30, the police contacted the telephone company BT, whose engineer confirmed that the phone line at the house was open, meaning the handset was off the cradle. This allowed for the line to be monitored, a task undertaken by the engineer until roughly 6 a.m, when the phone line was transferred to a local police station. Yet, according to a Scotland Yard report, this changeover coincided with the receipt of a 999 call from within the house. But was this purely administrative error or a misinterpretation of the documents? Is it possible that the transfer from BT to an emergency line at the police station has been misconstrued as the receipt of a 999 call? This is a plausible explanation supported by a statement from the officer tasked with monitoring the phone line, Nicholas Milbank, which was given to the inquiry in 2002 and made no reference to an emergency call. Instead, the officer stated that he was listening in to the open line and hadn't heard any disturbances until the raid team made entry. One peculiarity stood out, that being that Officer Milbank had not signed the document. Instead, his name had been typed on the signature line, raising questions as to whether he had actually provided the testimony. During an interview with Heidi Blake in 2024, Nicholas Milbank disclosed his recollections of that night and the supposed 6:09 a.m. call, stating, "From what I can remember, someone phoned 999. While the caller didn't speak to him, Officer Milbank stated he could hear noises in the background. What he surmised was voices on a radio. He also believed he heard furniture being moved and a door being opened and closed, going on to confirm to Heidi that all these noises implied to him that there was someone still alive inside the home. There is one aspect to take into account when considering Officer Milbank's testimony. Namely, when the raid team made entry, the radio was not on. So whose were the voices he heard? Is it possible he had simply heard the team outside giving the proximity of the phone to the kitchen window? Heidi also uncovered another aspect of the call, which only adds to the suggestion that some sort of cover-up may have occurred, as Officer Milbank would disclose to her that he had no knowledge of the statement provided to the inquiry in the early 2000s, adding that he hasn't been asked about the case since the 1980s. Officer Milbank's testimony seems compelling, but when viewed with a critical eye, one has to question after 40 years how reliable these recollections are. The passage of time and knowledge acquired after the fact can unfortunately taint and distort memories. But if his recollections are correct, then it does feed into the possibility that someone was still alive within the home. Further details would emerge to suggest that Sheila may have been mobile, as the logs also revealed that prior to making entry, an officer looked through the kitchen window and noted seeing the body of a woman lying on the floor. While in other logs, it states that 2 bodies were seen in that location, a male and a female. However, upon entering the home, only the body of Neville Bamber was found. Was the female seen through the window actually Sheila? Had she still been alive and gone upstairs prior to the raid team entering the kitchen? It is a possibility strengthened by the recollections of the officer tasked with guarding the foot of the stairs, which ascended from the kitchen to the first floor. He recalled hearing movement from above him and called up the staircase to Sheila but received no response. His experience has been explained away as being the movements of other members of the raid team who had started to search upstairs. However, this hasn't stopped some from putting forth the idea that he had actually heard Sheila. Once again, this implies the possibility that the 28-year-old had fled to her final resting place just prior to the officers finding her, which is reinforced by the suggestion that fresh blood was emitting from the corners of her mouth when her body was found. Could it have been Sheila's body in the kitchen, or was it a misunderstanding which was clarified upon the police entering the home to find only Neville's remains? One aspect which points to the likelihood that this was an error is the lack of any traces of dirt, sugar or glass on Sheila's clothing, which would have transferred had she been lying on the floor, with the timing of the sighting giving her little opportunity to change her clothing or have a wash. While some of these incidents could be written off as administrative error or misinterpretations, the conduct of Essex Police in the early stages of the investigation do little to quell these, as further mistakes were made, and a general lack of thoroughness has left room for criticism and conspiracy. The main point of contention regarding how the case was handled revolves around the lack of care taken by the police when it came to dealing with the scene and potential evidence. Many officers were notified that they were dealing with a murder-suicide prior to arrival, which possibly affected the care they took while in the home. After all, it was perceived as a straightforward case with all the deceased found within a locked house. It seemed obvious that they weren't looking for anyone else. This slightly affected the manner in which the investigation proceeded. Within 3 days, the home had seen carpets, furniture, and other items burned, and the bodies were released to the relatives for funeral arrangements. Over a month later, following duly coming forwards, more detailed searches were carried out, by which time a vast quantity of evidence had been lost, and even pieces that were required have been called into question over the years. On the day of the murders, the firearms team were the first ones to discover Sheila's body, lying on her back in the main bedroom, with the gun resting upon her chest and a Bible at her side. Yet some of these officers were made to second-guess their own recollections when they saw the crime scene photos, leading to them raising concerns that the images did not capture what they had seen. But in turn, they were provided reassurance by their superiors that the photos were accurate. Some recalled that Sheila's hand had moved, while others queried the location of the Bible. The blood-stained text allegedly had lain by her waist, yet the photos showed it resting by the deceased woman's shoulder. It was an issue raised during Jeremy's 2002 appeal, in which it was claimed that staining on the pages inside the Bible suggested the book had been closed, then opened again, causing a mirrored blood impression from one page to the next. This has been explained by the prosecution as being caused by Jeremy repositioning the Bible while he was staging the scene. Evidence by Ron Cook at trial spoke of no impropriety on the part of the scene of crime officers. Ron Cook, who led this team, would admit he had made adjustments to the scene in order to view other evidence, such as moving Sheila's hand in order to photograph the blood staining on her nightgown. He, however, insisted that each step was documented. But Ron's insistence that he was thorough in his approach was contradicted years later by a man who assisted him at the scene. Detective Sergeant Neil Davidson, who referred to his superior as Bumbling Ron. Unable to speak to Ron Cook, who had died several years earlier, Heidi Blake from the New Yorker managed to speak to Neil Davidson, who not only disclosed his superior's unflattering nickname, but also cast doubt on Cook's capability as a scene of crime officer. He informed Heidi that during the initial examination of Sheila's body, he recalled Cook, quote, lifted the Bible up and had a look at it, adding that his superior realised his error and fumbled with the pages, attempting to find the point at which it had originally been opened. He then placed it upon the ground roughly where he guessed it had been sighted, opting to position it in an area near Sheila's shoulder. When the photos were taken, the location was pointed out as seeming to be a strange place given how Sheila's body lay, which only fed into the suggestion that Jeremy had staged the scene, meaning that Cook, according to his former colleague, had inadvertently helped to implicate Jeremy. After advising Heidi about the weeks preceding the murders, during which Cook was playing catch-up, desperately trying to retrieve any trace of evidence against Jeremy, who was now a suspect, Davidson concluded his interview with the New Yorker journalist by stating, "I would not be surprised if one day someone came along and says, 'Here's definitive proof that he didn't do it.'" The implication that the crime scene had been disturbed by the police has been a source of contention since the beginning, especially due to the fact that so many items were discarded in a hapless manner, with one narrative being followed forsaking all other options. Jeremy argues that the lack of care shown by the police distorted the scene, as stated during his 2002 appeal, during which the defence claimed that the scene had been disturbed by the firearms team, accusing them of toppling over the chairs and shifting the table in the kitchen, leading to the appearance that there had been a violent struggle. If this was the case, then one could also suppose that they may have inadvertently caused the sugar bowl and plates to fall to the floor, thus explaining why Sheila's feet were clean. However, these accusations were not only denied by members of the firearms team, but condemned by one of the appeal judges, who stated that an officer to disturb the scene is a moral sin. It is only right to state that there was a lack of fairness. Officers had already reached a conclusion on what occurred, and this proved detrimental, opening Essex Police up for criticism and scrutiny. Aside from the complaints aimed at the police, the silencer is the most debated and arguably one of the single most important pieces of evidence in the case. Its location in the gun cupboard, alongside the discovery of Sheila's blood group found inside its barrel, signalled that another person must have committed the crime. As with other details in this case, the last 4 decades have seen this one small item be called into question, with people doubting the manner in which it was found, while forensic testing has cast doubt upon the blood evidence. There have been suggestions that it was planted, contaminated, switched, or that the evidence from multiple silencers acquired at the time was amalgamated to appear like there was only one. So let's start with the insinuation that the silencer was planted. The most obvious suspects for such an action would likely be Jeremy's relatives, a conclusion drawn from the fact that they were the ones who found it, and they had access to the farmhouse. The relatives had already voiced their mistrust of Jeremy, and on the day prior to the silencer being discovered, they visited the police station to discuss their concerns, only for DCI Taft Jones to dismiss them. The relatives also had a motive, namely preventing Jeremy from inheriting land, properties, and businesses they had a vested interest in. Jeremy's cousin Anne and her father Robert Boutflower started keeping daily journals, recording Jeremy's actions and their own speculations regarding what occurred. It was the relatives that brought the faulty latch on the kitchen window to the attention of D.S. Jones, and informed the police that June's bike was located at Jeremy's cottage. Meanwhile, Robert Boutflower had suggested the route and manner by which Jeremy had gotten to and from the farm, and he had also put forth a theory that his nephew had been wearing a wetsuit during the commission of the crime, which prevented the 24-year-old from sustaining injuries or leaving traces of evidence at the scene. Unfortunately, by the time Jeremy's ex-girlfriend Julie Mugford came forwards, potential evidence had been lost, as the relatives had been permitted to enter the home, and while there they proceeded to clean it, repositioning the furniture, and removed items further contaminating the scene. When Jeremy's cousin Anne was first given the keys to the farm, she was taken around the home by an officer who pointed out details, such as where individuals were found. And though it is just speculation, it is hard not to consider what else she may have gleaned from these interactions, which could have helped the relatives implicate Jeremy. These interactions between the relatives and the police have generated suggestions of collusion and pose the question, had information been exchanged between them? Were details passed on to Julie to ensure her testimonies were consistent with what the relatives had stated? These are serious allegations and would imply a large-scale conspiracy had taken place, one which multiple reviews and appeals have failed to corroborate. However, one could argue that the relatives' seemingly relentless campaign to voice their suspicions helped plant the seeds of doubt. But was it just their words that they had planted? It is undeniable that the relatives had access to the farmhouse, and it's plausible that, having been told a struggle had occurred in the kitchen, the relatives struck the moderator against the mantel, causing the damage and paint transfer. But where did the blood found on the device come from? It was known that Sheila was menstruating at the time of the killings, and that the buckets of water in the kitchen apparently contained her blood-stained underwear. This combined with a Home Office test which deemed that some blood was found in places that it couldn't have reached while the moderator was attached to the gun, and it was likely dripped onto the device rather than expelled into it by the force of a shot being fired. Could the relatives have used the blood-stained underwear to drip traces into the device? This was a scenario Detective Mike Ainsley was keen to quell, particularly when Anne revealed that she had disposed of the garments that were soaking in the buckets. This prompted the officer to caution her against mentioning this, as it may be used to imply that the relatives had planted the blood evidence and disposed of the clothing to conceal their actions. As plausible as this may be, it also suggests the family would have required some forensic knowledge, and while this allegation has been a theory that's done the rounds over the years, there have also been counterpoints to it as well, particularly as new information is revealed. With the advancement in DNA testing, it was hoped that new tests conducted on the moderator would prove without a doubt whose blood was on the device. However, Jeremy's defence team encountered a major setback when they learned that in 1996, Essex Police had carried out the destruction of most of the evidence held in storage without notifying the defence, nor had they taken into consideration that an active appeal was still underway. In the end, it was Sheila's birth mother who had helped supply the defence with a sample of her blood to allow for comparative tests to be conducted. But when these were carried out, no traces of Sheila's DNA was obtained from the moderator. This discovery cast doubt on the prosecution's assertion at trial that the presence of Sheila's blood on the moderator pointed to her death being inflicted by someone else. And based on this evidence, in 2001, Jeremy Bamber was granted a hearing at the Court of Appeal. However, it would be a short-lived victory, with the judges dismissing all 16 of the defence's points of contention, including the blood evidence. The Court of Appeal determined that extensive testing over the years had likely destroyed any traces of DNA. A plausible explanation, save for the fact that unidentified profiles had also been obtained from the moderator. But the judges considered that these contributions may have been made by one of many individuals who came into contact with the device over the years, including police officers, forensic teams, and members of the jury. Ultimately, they deemed the new blood evidence as inconclusive, and denied Jeremy's grounds for appeal. And while he lingered in prison, the unidentified profiles left another set of unanswered questions. During the 2024 New Yorker article on the case, journalist Heidi Blake spoke with David Boutflower, during which it was revealed that one of the unidentified profiles on the moderator belonged to him. Did this point to the speculation that he had participated in a ploy to frame Jeremy? Or is it possible, as he told Heidi, that while he was trying to unscrew the device to look inside, he had inadvertently left his DNA on it? With it being known that David held the moderator, there was always a probability that his DNA would be on it. Therefore, the identification of the profile had done little to clarify details in this case. But if David's profile, which had been left on the moderator just days after the killings, had survived rigorous testing, why didn't any traces from Sheila remain? Is it possible there was only a limited amount, which was, as implied by the appeal judges, destroyed due to extensive testing? Or does the absence of her blood support the notion that the moderator was never on the weapon when Sheila was shot, opening up the prospect that she may have been the perpetrator? This scenario is one I shall return to. However, for now, let's continue to discuss the issues with the moderator and why it has proved to be so contentious. Even if the relatives had not planted the silencer, the risk it was found by them and not the police presents other issues for the case, namely the risk of contamination and the questionable chain of custody. First of all, the moderator was removed from where it was found without any photos being taken, meaning there was no visual record of its position in the cupboard and possible clues that may have lain around it. Further issues which potentially compromise the integrity of the evidence involve the box containing the silencer being removed from the gun cupboard, further disturbing any potential clues. It was then moved to several locations, including the kitchen at White House Farm where Neville Bamber was killed, risking further contamination. The relatives admitted that the silencer was placed in a carrier bag, along with other items, including a telescopic sight, a gun magazine and ammunition. This was then placed in a box in the boot of Van Eaton's car and transported to her cottage. At the Eatons' home, the contents of the carrier bag were examined at the kitchen table by David, Anne and her husband Peter. David later testified that he had attempted to take the silencer apart in order to see the baffle plates inside. It was during this examination they noticed the damage, paint flecks and a red substance which prompted them to inform the police. The silencer was returned to the carrier bag along with the rest of the contents and stored in a cupboard under the stairs awaiting collection by DS Stan Jones. The chances of contamination during these actions was high and speaks of the lack of forensic awareness possessed by the relatives. One would hope that more care would have been taken by the police, but the manner in which the moderator was handled by DS Jones has also proved to be questionable. Upon being informed of the discovery, there seemed to be no urgency regarding the collection of the item. The silencer was found by the relatives on the 10th of August, yet it wasn't until the 12th of August that Stan Jones logged that he had taken possession of it. He arrived at the Eatons' home and sat at the kitchen table with Anne's husband, Peter, where the officer inspected the silencer and would later testify that, quote, "I also saw that on the side of the moderator there was a scratch mark with a burr, and attached to this burr was a grey-coloured hair about 3/4 of an inch long." But there is a suggestion that he hadn't considered he would be collecting any evidence of significance, as Stan Jones did not have the means to transport the silencer. As he stated, "I hadn't got suitable packaging to put the silencer in, so I got a kitchen roll holder and put one end around, put a peg on it, and carefully put the silencer in, and bent the other end around and put a peg on it. Once in the tube, no bag was used to preserve the evidence." Following complaints made by Jeremy regarding Essex Police, the City of London Police were tasked to carry out an investigation in 1991, during which Peter Eaton disclosed details regarding Stan Jones' conduct. Peter advised that while DS Jones was at his property, the officer enjoyed a few glasses of whiskey and declined Peter's offer to drive him to the police station, meaning that the detective sergeant allegedly drove while under the influence. However, it seems Stan did not head to the police station. Instead, it suggested that the silencer was kept in the boot of his car and he drove home, leaving the unassuming piece of evidence in the vehicle until the following morning, when he brought it to Witham Police Station, where it was initially placed in his desk drawer. The silencer was shown to fellow officers D.I. Ron Cook and D.I. Miller, with Stan drawing their attention to the damage, congealed substance, fleck of paint, and the grey hair. When D.I. Ron Cook submitted the silencer into evidence at the laboratory in Huntingdon, the grey hair had disappeared before any of the forensics team saw it. So before I continue with the silencer evidence, let's quickly address this grey hair and how important it was to the case. Given that it never made it to the laboratory, there's no way to determine who it belonged to. And as forensic expert John Hayward stated in court, there was no means by which to ascertain how, when, or where the hair had become attached to the silencer. However, the prosecution suggested that the hair had come from Neville, likely during the struggle in the kitchen. Judge Drake would also make mention to the hair during his summing up, in which he reminded the jury that it had been lost prior to examination. However, he also referenced John Hayward's speculation regarding how the hair had come to be attached to the silencer. And the judge noted defence counsel Geoffrey Rivlin's response to Hayward's theory, which Judge Drake stating, "I remind you perfectly what he said about Mr. Hayward. Then he agreed that if there was a grey hair on the moderator, it suggests that the moderator came into contact with Mr. Neville Bamber's head. That could account for Neville Bamber's blood in the silencer." But why were references to the grey hair even admissible in court? This piece of evidence had gone missing prior to any tests being carried out. Therefore, anything relating to it would surely be conjecture. Jeremy's allegations of impropriety on the part of the police is further supported by documents which have come into the possession of the campaign team, some of which imply that D.S. Jones may have attempted to fabricate evidence. In May 1986, a document identified as Action 1616 was created which contained references to the missing grey hair. It was determined during the Stoke-on-Church inquiry in 2002 that D.S. Stan Jones had made notations on the document in pencil, and it appeared there was, quote, hair stuck to this action. According to Jeremy's campaign team's podcast episode related to the hair, which I shall link in the podcast description, they state, Action 1616 relates to establishing what happened to the hair found on the moderator. It was found to have strands of hair sellotaped to it. So Stoke-on-Church had therefore discovered the whereabouts of the missing grey hair, which now appeared to have morphed into multiple hairs sellotaped to the original. End quote. However, the original Action 1616 document has not been made available to Jeremy's defence team, denying them the opportunity to not only confirm the existence of these hairs, also conduct DNA tests to establish who they belong to. It appears that paperwork makes up many of the key flaws in the case, and this extends to the identification numbers given to the silencer. Now, these labels and how they have been recorded have created another source of speculation, that being that there had been multiple silencers. When issuing identification numbers to pieces of evidence, it was often the practice that it would contain the initials of the individual who found it, followed by a number dependent on how many pieces of evidence that person had collated. In regards to the silencer, it was labelled with Stan Jones' initials. However, because he had not been the one who actually found the piece of evidence, the ID was changed to David Boutflower's initials. But this would be changed again to avoid confusion with the evidence collected by an officer who shared the same initials, resulting in David Boutflower's middle initial being added. This effectively created 3 identification numbers for one item, and when mentioned in logs, one of these 3 IDs were used, and had to be amended on occasion to reflect the correct one. It seems like a straightforward case of administrative error. but there have been suggestions that the police had taken possession of more than one silencer, and at some point during the forensic testing, the evidence from these separate items had become amalgamated into one and may have been contaminated while in the lab. Over the years, claims have been made that multiple silencers were collected over the course of the investigation, including a couple owned by Robert and David Boutflower, which were identical to the one recovered from White House Farm. Despite David claiming at the time their silencers were returned to them promptly, he has since admitted there came a point where they believed the items wouldn't be returned to them at all because so much time had passed. Could these identical silencers have been mixed up with the one from the farmhouse? Alternatively, could the one at the laboratory for experiments have been misconstrued? Perhaps the confusion over the labelling of the original silencer led to the data being amalgamated into one. There has been other claims made, including the suggestion that the police had found the silencer at the farmhouse on the day of the killings. These allegations range from it being found beneath the bed in the main bedroom. This would feed into the possibility that Sheila could have removed it herself. Another claim is that someone found the silencer lying on the floor and placed it in the cupboard, not realising its significance. However, according to statements made by the officers who attended the scene that day, none of them noticed a silencer. Once again, these suggestions point to a potential cover-up by Essex Police. But why? Was it to protect their officers who bungled the investigation? Or had something more serious occurred? Before I delve into the latter suggestion, let's focus on the officers whose integrity has been called into question. DCI Taff Tom Jones, who took charge of the inquiry from the outset, seemed so adamant that he was dealing with a murder-suicide that this appeared to cloud his ability to perceive any other possibility. His steadfast assertions meant that precious time and potential evidence was lost. Sadly, he passed away prior to the trial, denying him the opportunity to explain or defend his actions. There was at least one officer on the force who disagreed with DCI Taff Jones's conclusion, that being DS Stan Jones, but he too had come under scrutiny, from the manner in which he handled the silencer to the apparent relationship he had with the relatives and Julie Mugford. DS Jones had multiple interactions with the witnesses, which is to be expected given that he had primarily been tasked to act as a liaison and gather statements in the early stages of the inquiry. But had these interactions turned to collusion? Was information shared between them? Is that how Julie was able to provide details regarding the windows at the farm, and the notion that Jeremy used a bike to get to and from the farmhouse? Julie and Jeremy's interviews at the police station were written down, as Essex Police hadn't yet begun taping their interrogations. And some officers have conceded that notes during interviews may not necessarily have been written up on the same day that the interview takes place. This again has generated claims that statements were modified, coerced or coached in order to ensure the details matched with the agenda. Another suggestion of collusion comes from the deal that Julie allegedly made with the police in exchange for her cooperation, and while appeals and reviews have claimed there is little to back this up, a conversation with the bank manager suggests that when Julie admitted to committing checkbook fraud, she was accompanied to the bank by a police officer. During the meeting between Julie and the bank manager, an arrangement was reached that she could pay back the money owed, meaning no charges would be brought against her. The implication is that DS Stan Jones was the officer with Julie, and the police had sought to secure the bank's cooperation in order to maintain her credibility as a witness. While DS Jones has been accused of colluding with the witnesses and potentially manipulating evidence, as suggested by the hairs found on the Action 1616 document, his colleague DI Ron Cook, the officer in charge of collecting evidence from the scene, would also become a focus of criticism. Given the nickname Bumbling Ron by DS Neil Davidson, it seems that Cook had a reputation for mishaps. Not only has it been alleged he moved the Bible, there has also been questions raised regarding the handling of the silencer, which was taken to the lab by Cook, was then allegedly returned to the police station for 17 days, before being resubmitted for testing at Huntingdon. The issue is that no one seems to know what happened to the silencer over those 17 days, a time period during which Cook went back to Whitehouse Farm in order to acquire more evidence. This included paint scrapings from the mantle and a casting of the damage supposedly caused by the silencer striking the Argus around. In conversations with Heidi Blake, DS Neil Davidson alleged that when the silencer was initially submitted, it had a small fleck of paint on it. Yet when it was returned to the laboratory almost 3 weeks later, a more obvious transfer of paint was found. Had this simply been yet another administrative error, during which the forensic technician had not logged the details correctly when the silencer was first submitted? Or does this imply that the evidence on the device had been manufactured? While speaking to Heidi Blake, T.S. Davidson stated that when suspicion fell on Jeremy, D.I. Cook appeared to be scrambling to find evidence, especially because so much had been lost in the early stages. But could he really have been so desperate as to cause the damage and paint transfers? When I consider the accusations made against the relatives, Julie, and the police, I am constantly drawn back to the question, why? Why would they want to stage the scene, fabricate evidence, and ultimately frame Jeremy? Admittedly, the motives of the relatives seem the strongest. They feared losing so much if Jeremy had claimed his inheritance. Meanwhile, was Julie simply a woman scorned who had lost Jeremy and didn't want anyone else to have him? Had she agreed to provide evidence in exchange for charges against her being dropped, thus allowing her to continue her fledgling teaching career? But why would the police want to frame Jeremy? Did they fear that a guilty man would walk away? Or were they covering up their own failings, especially in the light of one particularly serious allegation? Jeremy's campaign team stated that over 40 individuals entered Whitehouse Farm on the 7th of August 1985. And while this included the raid team, the doctor and detectives, it also included a group who were allegedly there for firearms training. This claim not only implies a lack of care taken regarding the preservation of the scene, which in itself has serious implications, but there has been suggestions that Sheila's second gunshot wound was actually inflicted by one of these officers. This suggestion is supported by the statements of those who first arrived at the scene, who claimed they only observed a single wound to Sheila's neck. Reading the opinions of pathologists and forensic experts has thrown up conflicting opinions regarding how much the first shot would have affected Sheila. Dr. Peter Vanessis, who conducted the autopsy, stated he was unable to rule out the possibility she had died by her own hand. He would also waver on how much this affected her, suggesting that the initial shot could have incapacitated her, but also suggested she may still have been conscious. Blood evidence indicated she was likely in a seated position when the first shot was fired, which caused one expert to state that this position would have rendered it difficult for a third party to inflict the wound. However, the second wound was a fatal shot, but had this been inflicted by Sheila, Jeremy, or accidentally by a police officer? Is this the secret Essex police are trying to hide? Or is this just one of many conspiracies which haunt this case? I think it's important to point out that several reviews and appeals have found no impropriety on the part of any member of Essex Police. But there are so many gaps in the case, unanswered questions and evidence which can have multiple interpretations. For instance, is Sheila's blood missing from the silencer because of extensive testing? Or does its absence prove that the device wasn't on the gun when she was shot? If it was the latter, it opens up the possibility that Jeremy Bamber may be innocent. When it comes to the identity of the killer at Whitehouse Farm, there are only two possibilities, either Sheila or her brother. I admit that I have possibly missed certain details, as there is so much information to digest. Therefore, if you want to take a deep dive of your own, I highly recommend checking out Blood Relations, the definitive account of Jeremy Bamber and the Whitehouse Farm murders by Roger Wilkes, The Murders at Whitehouse Farm by Carol Ann Lee, The article and podcast by Heidi Blake from The New Yorker titled Blood Relatives, and the extensive catalogue available on Jeremy's campaign team website alongside their accompanying podcast. And now I turn it over to you, my lovely Northerners. Do you believe that Jeremy was guilty? Would you have convicted him given all the information disclosed during these episodes, or do you feel that Sheila may have been the culprit all along? Let me know your thoughts on X, Facebook, Instagram or YouTube. Thank you for joining me on It's Murder Up North. More episodes are coming soon.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.